Well, I'm just reading the news service reports, so I have no inside information at all. Of course, the situation is horrific. This mass horrific terrorist killing on the one side, and Israel now bombing Gaza, one of the most densely populated parts of the world, and saying that it is besieging Gaza, cutting off all fuel, food, electricity, water. It's, of course, a catastrophe from a humanitarian point of view, a catastrophe from a political and social point of view. So in horrible circumstances like this, the reactions can compound the disasters manyfold. We experienced 9/11 in the United States and ended up launching several wars in response that were also disasters for the United States and for those places affected. So it's really important in these tumultuous and horrible moments to think about consequences and about the future. And who knows whether that's happening right now on any side in the ongoing Israel-Palestinian conflict, which dates back a century now. So one could see horror compounded by horror, and that, of course, is my fear.
Professor Sachs, you're one of the more intelligent people I am privileged to know, and I've been asking this all day and can't seem to get a straight answer. How could Mossad, MI6, and CIA not have foreseen an attack that came from air, land, and sea involved thousands of human beings?
Look, what we see repeatedly in the upper echelons of government is self-delusion and self-deception. We had our National Security Council lead, Jake Sullivan, say 2 weeks ago that the Middle East is at the quietest time, I think he said, in decades,
yes,
a couple of decades. This is delusional. It's just willful thinking, motivated thinking that you want the situation in reality to be as you want it to be rather than as it is. So I'm not surprised by great errors by badly run governments. The Netanyahu government is absolutely has divided Israel. It's filled with right-wing radicals, as people know, and it divided Israel profoundly. How can one be making good judgments in such a circumstance? What we have in the United States is delusional about foreign policy and foreign affairs around the world. We declare things like Sullivan declared because that's the way we want them to be, not the way that they are. And this is actually not so unusual to see such blunders, because we think that governments are, led by fact-seeking, intelligent people. They're led by power-hungry people who have a motivated agenda and then interpret the data that they want to see, not the data as they come. And I think that this is basically what's happened. I don't have the deeper minute-by-minute understanding of this, but I think one shouldn't be surprised by a government like the one in Israel right now misjudging profoundly, because it's misjudging on many fronts. It's divided the country. You had millions of people in the street protesting against the government just weeks ago. Well, this is part of the same phenomenon.
Does this unite the Israeli people behind Prime Minister Netanyahu, or is his tenure in the Prime Minister's office finally coming to an end?
Both. The immediate responses unite around a leader the response the moment later is, what a disaster, time for this one to go. So this is the end of Netanyahu, but not in days, but counted in months or a short period of time. This is a complete disaster for this government. It will fall, but in the very short term, the response will be to unite.
The Israelis are looking for 155 millimeter artillery shells. We don't have them. We gave them all to Ukraine. How symbolic is this of our ability or inability to support two wars?
What we're hearing, again, I'm only a consumer of this information. I have no inside track at all, but we're hearing literally this morning reports that shells are being shipped from Poland to Israel that were intended for Ukraine for imminent delivery. So yes, we have been hearing not from the US, not from NATO until the last couple of weeks, that even before the crisis in Israel and Gaza, that the ammunition stocks were very, very low. And your guests that you've had on have been saying repeatedly that in a war of attrition, Ukraine would lose because the US simply didn't have the stockpiles.
Right.
So this is what we're seeing right now. And again, reports on the ground, not that I have any inside information, but as I listen, are saying that Ukraine basically stopped almost any kind of operations other than trying to dig in, which they may or may not be successful in doing because they just don't have the ammunition anymore. And they're certainly not going to get it in this context.
Okay. So because of its historical relationship with the United States, certainly in the post-1948 era, Israel will go to the head of the line when it comes to whatever military equipment we have that we can afford to get rid of. You just pointed out that that's happening in Poland, of all places.
Yes, this is right. It's, of course, and understandably going to be viewed as a dire emergency. It's got a political priority in the United States, and it has to dawn on the Ukrainians that, this is yet another disaster that is compounding what was already a disaster had they accurately assessed the situation. Of course, everybody lies. Everybody propounds false information in this. But those who watch closely have said that the ammunition shortfall has been intensifying for months in any event, even before these events. And now these events, spell an end to the supplies of even basic ammunition, much less tensions in other parts of the world. So this is really quite a dangerous and remarkable situation.
I want to play a clip in a minute of President Zelensky blaming, you can guess who, on the attack on Israel. But before I do, big picture, do you think an attack of this nature might cause the intelligence community to be a little bit more honest with its superiors rather than telling them what they think they want to hear? Somebody should have told Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin and eventually the president, things are not good in Gaza. Just because it's quiet doesn't mean it's going to stay quiet. Somebody should have told them. Russia is not the ineffective military that you thought it was in the Soviet days. Somebody should have told them. Ukraine is so corrupt, they'll sell what we give them to Hamas.
Unfortunately, the history is that events like this worsen intelligence rather than improve intelligence. 9/11 was itself a massive intelligence failure.
Right.
But that's not how it was treated. It was treated as the occasion for the launch of the GWAT, the Global War on Terror, immediately followed by the war in Afghanistan, and then by a war on totally false premises in Iraq in 2003. In fact, we know that the intelligence was subverted in the case of Iraq quite devastatingly. Basically, it was twisted by the senior politicians. And this is typically what will happen after an event like this. The motivated thinking becomes even more powerful, not a search for the truth, but a search to an effort to hide the truth and a search for victory. And victory for politicians means somehow revenge and so forth, not an accurate understanding of what happened. So I'm afraid that we're not likely to get much of an account. And part of the problem is we keep discussing, especially regarding Ukraine, but it's true in general, there's no accountability at all for the intelligence services, in part because they're so deeply enmeshed in operations, not just intelligence. This was the fundamental error, in my view, for American democracy in 1947, which was to make the CIA both an intelligence agency and an army at the same time. And one is politically motivated direction, that's the army, and the intelligence, which is supposed to really provide the information, is utterly compromised by the second function. And so I think that we're unlikely to see that kind of clarity that you're talking about come out of this. We're likely to see an escalation of violence, which it's not impossible, and I don't mean to predict it because I don't know, and it's very early days, but could lead to, a spreading war in the Middle East, not only an event.
Do you think that the neocons and globalists might lose their appetite for the support of the Ukraine war, particularly in the U.S.? The Lindsey Graham folks, in deference to the cry for help from Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Well, they've never shown much capacity to judge real capabilities before, so I'm not sure that we will have anything other than demands for escalation across the board, standing strong. America's reputation now is at stake. War with Iran, which I think Lindsey Graham called for, if I'm not mistaken. I apologize if I am mistaken, but I think in recent tweets he says that this war should now be expanded. He didn't say our limitation of ammunition requires us now to understand what to do. I think the tendency of these kinds of politicians is to escalate. That's really their language. That's their MO. And I think events like this trigger terrible further events. And that is perhaps where we're headed right now. I don't see cool heads prevailing on any front.
Here's President Zelensky. There's 2 points from this. This is either yesterday or today, but it's after the Hamas attack on Israel. One is that he says he addressed the foreign ministers of NATO nations. I didn't know that. And I'm going to ask you, what the heck do you think he told them? The other is, take a guess on whom he blames the attack on Israel.
Well, I don't have to.
Today was a very eventful day. Various meetings, and among them those related to the latest international developments, are of particular importance. I held a meeting with the heads of our intelligence, main intelligence directorate, and foreign intelligence service, as well as with our diplomats on the situation in and around Israel and on the overall situation in the Middle East. This is of fundamental importance for us, not only for Ukraine, but also for the entire Europe. According to the available information, a very clear one, Russia is interested in triggering a war in the Middle East so that a new source of pain and suffering could undermine world unity, increase discord and contradictions, and thus help Russia destroy freedom in Europe. We see Russian propagandists gloating. We see Moscow's Iranian friends openly supporting those who attacked Israel. And all of this is a much greater threat than the world currently perceives. The world wars of the past started with local aggressions. We know how to counter this threat. We are preparing appropriate steps. And most importantly, we are defending the need for maximum unity in the world. Today, I address the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, first of all, on the issue of unity. Every state in the world must now choose how it will defend international law.
He's got to be terrified that the neocons and the globalists will lose interest in him. I almost can't imagine what he would have said that would have been accepted as rational to the NATO. I've never even heard of this thing. You would know it. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Is there a NATO Parliament, Professor Sachs?
I think it is. I'm not even sure, but I think he means parliamentarians from NATO nations, not a NATO parliament per se. So it's parliamentarians that are from NATO countries. Oh, the chilling part is basically, not quite a call, but a kind of prediction of World War III.
Yes.
This is not out of the possibilities. We are in a world of violence and a world with an absence of diplomacy. And we are in a world of lots of grievance and lots of weapons. And we're not talking, the United States doesn't talk to Russia. It barely talks to China. It does not, of course, talk to Iran. And the truth is that there is absolutely the possibility of these wars spilling more and more widely to utter disaster. In fact, it is the dynamic of war that it spreads unless there are leaders smart enough to stop it. And the American mindset from World War II is you don't stop it, you completely defeat your enemy. Unconditional surrender is an American idea. The problem is in our current age, it's an impossible idea. That impossibility is not accepted in American ideology and among these leaders. But we live in a nuclear age where unconditional surrender of the opponent is not possible. We live in an age where technological capacity of warfare is much more spread widely than we like to believe. We thought Putin could never stand up against NATO weapons. We thought he would just simply back down. We thought a lot of things. The Israelis really thought that they were completely secure and had no reason to negotiate with Palestinians on anything. They really believed that a few days ago. And all of that mindset is false in our world today. If we don't have diplomacy, we won't have peace. If we don't have peace, we will have spreading war, actually. So Zelensky's, it's very chilling to watch that. It's almost like a clip from a movie, not a real life discussion. You know, he looks like a character in a movie, and he was a character in a movie. Right. That was his career. But it looks like something that you would see in a movie theater, not something that you expect to see in real life. And he talks about unity. He means exactly the opposite of unity. He means our side needs to defeat the other side. So he's talking about the deepest division possible and acknowledging basically that it could mean World War III, but in such circumstances, we need to be united, we, our side.
Are you worried that if the Israeli Defense Forces go too far and literally level Gaza, And if the United States Navy shells Gaza either directly or through jets that are on the Air Force carrier, that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Jordan, Egypt are not going to sit still.
Yes, I think that if there is a full-blown attack on Gaza, there will be a wider war. Iran and others would probably call for that, and there would be probably some reaction in that way. In other words, a full-blown attack against millions of people trapped in this very, very small, extremely densely settled enclave would be a prelude, quite possibly, to a wider war. Secretary General Guterres said today he called on Israel to abide by international law, by international humanitarian law, by international law of warfare. He said that besieging Gaza would, cutting off all food, water, power, would violate international law. If I heard correctly, the quick tape, remember, I'm halfway around the world, so I'm just hearing parcels of information, but clearly the Secretary General warned specifically about that kind of overreaction, and not only that it would be a violation, a deep violation of international law and a humanitarian catastrophe, but I think that we have to judge that it could absolutely lead to a wider war.
Here is the UN Secretary General in New York earlier today.
With a 56-year-long occupation and no political end in sight, it's time to end this vicious circle of bloodshed, hatred, and polarization. Israel must see its legitimate needs for security materialized, and Palestinians must see a clear perspective for the establishment of their own state realized. Only a negotiated peace that fulfills the legitimate national aspirations of Palestinians and Israelis, together with their security alike, the long-held vision of a two-state solution in line with United Nations resolutions, international law, and previous agreements, can bring long-term stability to the people of this land and the wider Middle East region.
Know him, you've advised him, you talk to him just like you and I are talking now without the cameras and microphones. Is there little more he can do than make public statements?
You know, I've advised 3 secretaries general. It's an incredible and unique job being secretary general. All the problems come to you, but all the power resides with the major powers. And so he embodies international law. He embodies the decisions made by the global community, but he can't enforce any of those. That depends on the United States, China, Russia, UK, France, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, together putting into practice the decisions that have been made by the global community, including the UN Security Council. But what he also noted is this is 56 years onward of this occupation, and there is no two-state solution in prospect because a significant part of the Israeli politics led by the current Prime Minister Netanyahu and a significant part of the U.S. politics that supports Israel has never wanted it. And certainly the current government in Israel doesn't want it. And so this impasse is not something that a UN Secretary General can resolve. But what he is saying is that without a resolution of the underlying politics, there is no peace possible. You know, I think this is the main lesson that I see for Ukraine, for Israel and Palestine, and for so many other conflicts. A very, very famous saying by the theorist of war, von Clausewitz, his most famous saying is that war is the continuation of politics with other means. This is very important for people to understand. When you see conflict, this is not madness almost ever. It's politics. It's brutal politics, but it's a continuation of politics with other means. And what that means is that solutions are inevitably requiring politics. And that usually means diplomacy, statecraft, not some unilateral military end-all victory. But this is not the mindset, of course, of people in battle, and it's certainly not the American mindset. Our mindset is unconditional surrender of a foe. And at some times in history that has happened, but in most times of history, it's a great illusion. And what we do in our discourse is deny any politics. We just like to say, oh, that's an evil attack. That's an evil person. We don't even try to explore the politics. In the Israel-Palestine issue, there is underlying politics, by the way, that goes back 100 years. Right. Very intense politics. I've spent most of my life, you know, seeing it, absorbing it from both sides. But we don't want to talk about that. We want to say, okay, it's terror. Now we have to respond and we will crush the opposition. No politics in that. And similarly, the way we reacted in Ukraine or vis-a-vis
respect to Ukraine.
Look, 30 years ago, at the end of the Soviet Union, the neocons had the idea that now it's a unipolar world. The United States would be, should be, and must continue to be the world's only superpower. And so the neocons took aim to expand the U.S. military alliances everywhere in the world, tremendously overextending us. And one of the plans specifically was to surround Russia in the Black Sea region with NATO. And that has proven to be yet another neocon disaster, because I would add to the list of neocon disasters the war in Iraq, the war in Syria, the war in Libya, the war in Afghanistan, and now we have the war in Ukraine, a war that was provoked in very significant part by the attempt that has been pretty relentless now for a quarter century to push NATO right up to Russia's border, 2,300-kilometer border, by the way, with Ukraine. And Russia kept saying, no, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. The neocons, their whole game is not to listen. After all, we're all powerful. And so every time Russia said that, from Gorbachev first, then Yeltsin, then Putin, the neocons said, doesn't matter, it's a bluff. We can do what we want. We are the only superpower. And when things got sticky in 2010 to 2014, when Ukraine elected a president that didn't want NATO, that wanted neutrality, the U.S. ended up conspiring in his overthrow. That was in February 2014. And they continued the march onward. And here we are today. Ukraine is getting destroyed. This is no favor to Ukraine. This is, as an adage that I constantly repeat, Henry Kissinger famously said that to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And here we are creating disaster in Ukraine, absolute disaster.
What is their basis for their hatred of all things Russian, and the personification of that hatred onto President Putin? Why are they willing to shed the blood of other people? How perverse were the comments of Senators Romney and Blumenthal? Best money we ever spent. We're killing Russians and no American boys are dying. I mean, this is morally reprehensible. Okay, I've asked you a lot of questions.
No, we're hearing that line because it's a neocon slogan. We heard it recently from the Dutch defense minister in a conference yesterday. I hear it from a lot of Congress people. It's unbelievable the depth of this cynicism in that. Oh, it's the Ukrainians dying. We're getting our money's worth. No Americans are dying. They're fighting for us. It's grotesque. Now, where this comes from is this sense that we need to be all powerful. So there's a profound resentment of any other country that professes to have some power and say in the world. And by the way, it actually goes back to the British Empire. The Russophobia in the British Empire is even more remarkable than the Russophobia in the American capital. And you could trace from the 19th century onward this intense desire to crush Russia. And by the way, this precedes communism. This extends past communism. This is just something that is deeply embedded, cultural and ignorant, because I've worked with the Russians. I've worked with the Ukrainians. I was an advisor to President Gorbachev's economic team. I was an advisor to President Yeltsin's economic team. I was an advisor to President Kuchma, the first president of independent Ukraine, to his economic team. They wanted just normal relations. Normal. They didn't view the United States as an enemy. They wanted normal relations. We could not take yes for an answer of just normalcy. We had to dominate. And that's the whole neocon approach.
Here's the princess of neocons, your fellow Columbia faculty colleague, the former Secretary of State, blaming your attitude and mine and the attitude of the thousands watching us on Vladimir Putin.
I think Putin is not only thrilled by the divide over whether we continue and at what levels to fund Ukraine, I think he is fomenting it as well. Putin and his team that does the kind of interventions, covert and overt, aiming to undermine democracy and to suborn political leaders, is a big part of how he sees his role.
Extraordinary.
So who would take this? The former Secretary of State.
But by the way, extraordinary.
A direct descendant in the line that started with Thomas Jefferson, and she's mouthing this nonsense.
Well, talk about suborning and covertly overthrowing other governments. She was the mastermind that we're going to overthrow the Syrian government in 2011. Look at the debacle over the next 12 years, complete devastation of that country. She was the one that said we had to overthrow the Libyan government. Look at the disaster. She was the one, after all, that oversaw Victoria Nuland as we participated in the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in 2014. Absolutely extraordinary. And not except, by the way, it's just the demonstration of a very great difficulty in listening to others in the world. This is a big problem.
Do you sense, Professor Sachs, that support in Europe for sending military aid to Ukraine is beginning to wane?
It is waning fast. We just had an election in Slovakia this past week, where the new government, the candidate that led the party that won the most votes, was campaigning on ending all military support for Ukraine. And that party won a decisive election victory. In Poland, which has been the stalwart supporter, they're barely on speaking terms with Ukraine right now because of massive feuds on many fronts. Hungary has long been opposed to the U.S. neocons, and Prime Minister Orban has been very clear-headed, I would say, uniquely so in Europe for a long time. But what's happening in the places that are still strongly supporting Ukraine is that essentially every political leader in Western Europe right now is unpopular. This is amazing. Just like in the United States, President Biden's disapproval ratings are much, much higher than his approval ratings. This is true throughout Europe right now. And this is the sign that people are very unhappy with the way things are going and the direction that's being taken.
The new defense minister of Great Britain recently made some allusions to boots on the ground, and there was a significant pushback. And then Prime Minister Sunak, using a very British phrase, said, well, we don't mean it in the here and now. You know these folks better than I do. What does that mean? We meet it next week? Are they seriously considering boots on the ground, maybe in the Biden mode where they're out of uniform so he can claim they're not combat? Or are they seriously considering sending troops in this never-ending war that the Russians are about to triumph in?
I have to tell you, you know, when I was growing up, when I was starting my career, I adored the British, they speak such beautiful English after all, and it seemed so sophisticated. But over time, over decades, I've come to understand that this imperial mentality is so deep in Britain. They not only cheerlead the United States, they love war with Russia, and they have, at least since Palmerston led the empire in the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, which is just like the war we have right now. It was the desire to surround Russia in the Black Sea and to crush Russia's military power by taking over Sevastopol naval base, which was Russia's imperial naval base from 1783. It's the same attitude till today. The British are even worse than the American neocons, if I could say that. It's been shocking to me. The British media is for war morning till night. And it's so deeply imbued in the imperial outlook. It's amazing to.
But is that because there are no British boys coming home in body bags?
You know, it's a reverie. They still think that they're a world empire, and it's so easy on the sidelines, as you're pointing out. Yes, they're on the sidelines. They're giving such great advice that Ukraine has lost, by one recent estimate, 500,000 killed. And it was the British who loved this counteroffensive that started in early June that has been a complete devastation of Ukraine.
How can the European globalists and the neocons close their eyes to the economic, demographic, and military catastrophe, destruction, demolition, whatever word you want to use, that has become Ukraine?
Because they are blinded by ideology. They are blinded by this hatred of Russia. They are not counting the Ukrainian dead. They have lied to the public all along about the military situation. By the way, as has the mainstream media in the United States, starting with the New York Times, which has been disgraceful during this whole war. And the point is, they're just not telling the truth. They want so much to fight Russia and to have someone else do the fighting and the dying. that they want another massive recruitment of the remaining Ukrainian young men that can be grabbed off the streets and be thrown into the killing fields almost without any training, from what we're hearing from the soldiers themselves on the front line that are dying in massive numbers. And what we're being told is they have no training, and they're being sent. Russia has air superiority, it has artillery superiority, it has drone superiority, and this is absolutely clear. If you watch day by day the battlefield reports, and you listen to multiple sources, not just what is coming out of London and Washington, and they don't care because they are driven by ideology.
I have to play another clip of your fellow faculty member. This is former Secretary Clinton, cut 3, Gary, saying, "This fight is our fight."
I know that the majority of Congress is still in favor of supporting Ukraine. So we've got to get through this period. We have to pass legislation and continue to support. And, you know, Jeff, this fight is our fight. Honestly, I don't understand any American siding with Putin, but we've seen it and we've heard it, and we have to fight against it.
I want to say very clearly, I am not siding with Putin. I'm siding with Ukraine. I don't want Ukraine to be completely destroyed by these neocons, by their fantasy world, by their desire to throw Ukrainians by the hundreds of thousands to their death, by the destruction of Ukraine, by pushing NATO, NATO, NATO. This is the issue. This isn't siding with Putin or siding with anybody. This is trying to protect Ukraine from American zealots.
You know,
and you know, our own top diplomats. I'm not speaking about Secretary Clinton. I'm talking about professional diplomats who have understood this from the beginning. George Kennan, Jack Matlock, our ambassador to the Soviet Union, William Burns, who's now CIA director and was the U.S. ambassador to Russia in 2008. They have understood completely as professionals that this push of NATO enlargement to Ukraine was completely reckless and would lead to war. And then anybody serious in this, not the propagandists, but people serious in this, the ones, Judge, you have been interviewing all along, have known that Ukraine is not going to beat Russia militarily on the battlefield. Quite the contrary. It's going to get destroyed in this war. And that's what's happening in front of our eyes. And so when Secretary Clinton says, oh, this is our battle, what she means is that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are dying. That's what she means by our battle.
Professor Sachs, I've never seen you so angry, but
because
it's a righteous anger. She's attributing to us motivations that we don't have in order to justify her own political biases, and you put your finger on it, right on the pulse of it. Suppose there is some sort of a peace negotiation. Suppose there is some sort of a standstill, and suppose Joe Biden promises Vladimir Putin that NATO will not move any further eastward. Why would Putin believe him?
You know, we're so far down this path that it's absolutely tragic. I don't know whether Biden at this stage of his, you know, even his physical situation, whether he could really negotiate at this point. But we could have negotiated to avoid this conflict. This conflict was so avoidable. There were so many off-ramps that stretch back 30 years, by the way, but stretch back to before 2014, before overthrowing Yanukovych, that stretched to 2016, 2017, when an agreement was reached. Russia wasn't demanding the territory of Donbass. It was demanding that Ukraine honor a UN Security Council-backed agreement called the Minsk II Agreement that would have given autonomy to the Donbass, not annexation. And people don't remember this, and they're not reminded of this. Russia wasn't demanding the Donbass's territory, but the United States was telling Ukraine, you don't have to implement that agreement, even though it was voted 15-0 by the UN Security Council. You can blow it off. We don't believe in autonomy for the Donbass. We believe that as a unitary state, you should be a NATO member. That's what we told them. And then on December 17th, 2021, when President Putin put on the table a draft security arrangement between Russia and the United States, perfectly sensible, a lot to negotiate, but based on no NATO enlargement, we could have avoided the war then too. This war could have ended in March 2022 when Zelensky, in a moment of, in a glimmer of reality, a realization of the situation, said we can be neutral. And on that basis, Zelensky and Putin were close to signing an agreement until the United States rushed in and said, no, you don't have to do this. This is our fight and your fight. We have your back, so go to it. And hundreds of thousands of dead later, here's where we are. So this war could have been avoided so many times with negotiations. What President Biden should do today is pick up the phone, and I've offered my Zoom link, and I'm sure you could offer your studio link to him so he could call President Putin, because he hasn't spoken to him one time since February 2022, and say, look, we got to end this thing. We got to stop the bloodshed, stop the fighting, stop the destruction of Ukraine. We got to sit down and negotiate. I accept NATO is not enlarging. I accept that you have security interests that are real. I accept, by the way, that we got to get back also to negotiations over nuclear weapons, because that's part of what has made this so dangerous, because the U.S. unilaterally walked out of the anti-peace speech, which was given on June 10, 1963. This was a most remarkable speech. It was part of Kennedy's effort to secure a kind of peace, and especially a treaty with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, to ease tensions and to begin a process of nuclear safety. The Cuban Missile Crisis had occurred in October 1962. It had brought the world to the very brink of nuclear war. And Kennedy and his counterpart in the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, both felt that this was far too close for comfort, that the world could not live at the edge of disaster without actually falling right over the edge. And so in 1963, Kennedy made a concerted campaign for peace. And what's notable about that campaign is that he was directing his effort at the United States. He was helping to explain to Americans that peace was possible even with the Soviet Union, which was viewed as the dire enemy. And Kennedy, with incredible bravery, eloquence, and insight, told the American people in this speech, now 60 years old this year, that the Soviet people are people with honor, just like the American people, that they have the same desires for peace, and that even countries like the Soviet Union, that the United States felt was an enemy, would follow through on treaties if they were in the Soviet interest as well as the U.S. interest, so that it was possible to negotiate with the Soviet Union. Now, this speech was so eloquent and so powerful and so unusual in that it was addressed to the American people, not finger pointing or yelling at the Soviets, but rather explaining to the American people that peace is possible with the Soviet Union, that Nikita Khrushchev, upon hearing the speech or receiving the speech, called for it to be widely published throughout the Soviet Union. He immediately summoned the special envoy of President Kennedy to Russia. That was Averell Harriman, a senior figure in American diplomacy and in the American Democratic Party. and told Harriman that this was the fine skill, toured throughout the United States to help the American people understand the significance of the treaty. And Kennedy knew that he would face opposition, even in the U.S. military, among the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he wanted the American people to know this was a treaty in their interest. In the end, in September 1963, the treaty was ratified by an overwhelming majority of the Senate. Kennedy had succeeded in achieving an agreement with the Soviet Union, signing a crucial treaty, and having it ratified by the U.S. Senate. An act of stunning statesmanship. In fact, in my view, 1963 was one of the finest years of a more devastating and tragic. He was, in my view, the last great U.S. president. The rest have not lived up to that year of statesmanship, even close. And this is where we are today. You know, imagine Biden giving a speech to the American people explaining, yes, we should negotiate with Russia's interests. It seems it would be impossible for President Biden to do that. And I think when it comes to Biden, yes, I don't expect that, though I would hope for it. But this is what Kennedy achieved, and he proved how crucial the mindset is. After all, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty succeeded. It played its historic role until today of stopping atmospheric tests of nuclear weapons, and it played a absolutely clear role of putting the U.S. on, and the world, I should say, on the path to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty a few years later. Now, to bring it to the immediate context, I personally strongly believe that the U.S. and Russia and Ukraine should, and so I do see powerful parallels. There is a mutual interest of peace, actually across all three countries. Ukraine, in the absence of peace, is getting destroyed. It's so tragic. Ukraine is caught in a war between Russia and the United States. Its leaders allowed it to be caught. I told them, you hear the United States saying, we protect you. Well, I'm 68 years old. The United States did not protect Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and every other misadventure of the United States. But the Ukrainians weren't listening. Now the country is getting destroyed. It's in their interest for a negotiated peace. It is in Russia's interest for a negotiated peace that would solve these issues and present a security arrangement for Europe that would make sense. It is in America's interest to stop the destruction of Ukraine. It's not going to happen on the battlefield. This has been demonstrated. It's going to happen at the negotiating table. The United States can and should have said all along that NATO will not enlarge in a context in which Russia stops the war. That's the basis for peace. And the United States blew it. Biden refused to negotiate when this issue was put on the table repeatedly by Putin, and then finally on December 17th, 2021, when Putin tabled a draft agreement between the U.S. and Russia for security arrangements. And the United States absolutely foolishly and recklessly said, no, we don't negotiate the issue of NATO with you. It's none of your business, the United States told Russia. That is a whopper, to say that it's none of Russia's business whether the U.S. expands its military to Ukraine. Of course it's Russia's business. Of course it should be negotiated. It should have been negotiated. It's all ridiculous. Scholz was told, he knows, he should tell the German people, full stop. Come on. And this is absolutely clear because it was spelled out by Nuland, it was spelled out by Biden, it was explained by Hirsch. And come on, German media, cover the story. It's crucial for the German economy. It's crucial for the European economy. It's crucial for understanding about this war. Time for people to grow up. Scholz knows it. He should explain. He should say, okay, it made sense, or it didn't make sense, or we opposed it, or we supported it. But of course the United States did it. Even the pathetic explanation that they give right now, we are working. They tell us, by the way, in indirect ways, the truth. They said it would end if Russia invaded. Nuland made this threat as clear as could be. Biden repeated the threat with Scholz standing next to him. You don't need much more to understand this. So the German media really have let down the German people, but I should also say that the American media have completely let down the American people as well. The New York Times, pathetic, wouldn't even report Hirsch's story. Like the German media, has had a devastating defeat this summer with a bloodbath, with tens of thousands of Ukrainians killed, vast numbers wounded, a massive destruction of the military equipment given by the West, a complete failure. Slovakia just elected a government that campaigned on the platform of stopping all support for Ukraine. Poland doesn't speak to Ukraine. The two governments are not even on speaking terms right now. In the United States, a majority of the United States citizens don't want more aid to Ukraine. And that majority is extremely large in the Republican Party. The $6 billion, which was a stopgap in a stopgap legislation, was stripped out in order to pass the rest of the legislation because the Republicans would not accept it. So all this talk by Baerbock and others doesn't mean anything right now. The public's against it. Every European political leader that is in support of this war has massive disapproval ratings that way exceed the approval ratings. And one can just track those weekly to see the fact that the European public knows this is a disaster. This is a disaster for Ukraine, first and foremost, because all that was said by NATO was wrong. This is, by the way, again, I'm 68 years old. I've heard it from U.S. generals for decades. I don't believe a word that they say. And I was clear this time around. Refusal of Ukraine and Germany standing on the side and France standing on the side in the U.S. to honor the Minsk II agreement. This war was provoked by the U.S. role in the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014. And this war is not going to end successfully on the battlefield, no matter what Baerbock or others say. What these foreign ministers say doesn't matter. And these governments aren't even in Western Europe are going to face electorates that are profoundly unhappy. And where the support of many governments, the approval rating of many leaders is in the 20% or 30%, with disapproval ratings in the 50s or 60%. We're democracies. Public opinion shows that this is on the wrong track. So we need to get to the negotiating table. We need diplomats that actually remember that they're diplomats, not cheerleaders for war. So this is really remarkable at this date to hear this kind of continued rhetoric, as if the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian dead don't teach a lesson already in which NATO stops its relentless enlargement. The United States has military bases in 80 countries and bases numbering more than 800. Stop. This is absolutely, completely wrong. We need a world in which the words rule-based order mean the UN, not the order of the United States. That rhetoric is obnoxious the way that it's used, because we have rules. They're called, has that mattered to the United States? It's against the WTO rules to impose unilateral trade restrictions. It's against international monetary rules to seize the foreign exchange reserves of other countries. But the United States does that repeatedly. The United States has been nearly in perpetual war. The United States has engaged in dozens and dozens of covert regime change operations. We need a world in which the covert regime change operations end, in which the United Nations is honored and strengthened, in which treaty enlargement starts talking with other countries, stops unilaterally leaving treaties like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement, both of which the United States left unilaterally. This is what a world of peace would mean. We made the United Nations for that purpose. We should honor it, live by it, respect the UN Charter, and strengthen a multipolar,